think, because I'm not a postmodern thinker. And okay, so you see how the argument goes. So the fact that we don't see any practical advantage in inquiring into the notion of human dignity, Waldron thinks, and I agree, is not a sufficient reason for abandoning the inquiry in the same way in which we don't think it's a good idea to abandon quantum physics simply because so far we haven't found the practical application of it. Okay, now comes, I think, what is the most valuable contribution that Waldron gives us on this business of the foundation of human rights, and that is the distinction of four different senses in which we can talk about a foundation. When we say that we are after, that we look for a foundation of human rights, Waldron says, we may think at least four different things. We may think that alpha is the foundation of beta, so in our context, human dignity is a foundation of human rights. We may mean by that, one, that as a matter of history or genealogy, beta was generated out of us. So in this case, the claim would be that human rights historically were generated out of a concern about human dignity. So in the history of ideas, so to speak, or in the history of political thought or even of political activism, there was first a definition of human dignity, I don't know, in the 17th century we had a lot of philosophical reflection on human dignity, and we ended up with some notion of it, and from this the notion of human rights was generated. Now, about this first sense, Waldron is fairly skeptical. He says, I mean, that's not how history went. All human rights and fundamental freedoms derive from the inherent dignity of the human person, say the official documents, but this statement should not be understood, this statement should be understood in a philosophical rather than historical sense. As history, it would probably be more correct to say the opposite, namely that the idea of dignity reflects socio-historical conceptions of basic rights and freedom, not that it generated them. So, according to Waldron, first in the history, first come a talk about rights, and then an attention to human dignity, not the other way around. So we don't have, according to this view at least, we don't have an official document that says what human dignity is, and then we have the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens, we have the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, I mean, all these ancestors of human rights, not to mention that, after this putative treatise on human dignity, from this, the official documents were thrown, because that's not the case. I mean, you could contest this idea and say, well, wait a minute, I mean, there is Pico della Mirandola on the dignity of man, on the dignity of human being, that's 15th century. So what history are we talking about? If we are talking about the history of ideas, of course the rights talk does not come after or is generated by a philosophical reflection on human dignity, but at the same time I mean, Cicero, Pico della Mirandola, these people talked about dignity. So I think that the claim that Waldron should be making here is that both reflection and formulations of rights and dignity happened in the history of ideas, but it's not clear that the reflection on human dignity was ever used to come to a better understanding of what rights are. So sort of the argument should be, it's not clear which one comes first. What seems to be the case is that the talk or the documents that we had about rights do not seem to be derived from the contemporary or previous documents or philosophical reflections on the concept of human dignity. Okay, so that's probably not the way in which we want to think of a foundation of human rights if we think that dignity is the foundation of human rights. So we don't have to understand that in a historical or temporal way. Now, the second way in which we might understand this relation is that dignity is the source of human rights in the way that the application of one legal proposition may be the source of the validity of the other. So here Waldron takes side against this idea by Klaus Dicke that suggests that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, quote, "The dignity of human beings is a formal transcendental norm to legitimize human rights claim," end of quote. So, kind of Kelsenian idea that human dignity may play the role of the Grundnorm in Kelsen. So it's a sort of ultimate norm that justifies the authority of all the juridical layers that you may have below this Grundnorm. Now, I mean, I don't want to go into detail this option because I mean, Waldron tells us that Dicke misunderstands Kelsen here because Kelsen had an idea of dynamic foundation when he introduced this idea of the Grundnorm. What we usually mean by a foundation, by dignity being the foundation of human rights, is not that dignity entitles the assembly that decided on the Universal Declaration to issue that sort of constitution about human rights, which would be the dynamic interpretation of the Grundnorm that Kelsen has. But what is usually meant is what Kelsen calls the static interpretation of a foundation, which basically means that you think of the relation between human dignity and human rights not as dignity giving authority to the assemblies that decided about human rights, but more in the sense of giving an overarching concept that is used not in an analytic way perhaps, but to come to these more specific rights that we have in the list. So do we have to think of the foundation of human rights in this second sense? Interrogation mark. Again, as usual, Waldron doesn't take side or for or against any of the things he says, basically. But I guess his main point here is simply to rule out an interpretation of the relation between human dignity and human rights as in the similar to the relation that there is between the Grundnorma in Kelsen legal theory and lower levels of legislating authorities. Okay, the last two senses are the most interesting. The third one is, I guess, what we all think of a foundation of human rights, that is in the most traditional way. So, the example that the most traditional way is to say that human rights are derived from human dignity, or that human dignity is the foundation of human rights, in the sense that you can infer with or without some extra empirical premises the content of human rights from the content of human dignity. So that's, I guess, also the interpretation of the foundation of human rights that I was suggesting. So the strong notion of inference from one concept to other concepts. Not as an analytical inference, perhaps, in the sense that all, like in the Kantian analytic judgments, anything that you may find in human rights is already contained in the concept of human dignity. No, but that would be a certainly too strong notion of a foundation. We don't find all the things that we found in human rights already contained, implicit in the notion of human dignity. Nobody thinks that way. But there must be some way of making a logical connection between whatever we decide is in the concept of human dignity and what is the content of the human rights. The example that Griffin gives of this third way of conceiving of a foundation of human rights is Griffin. Griffin, in his famous book on human rights, 2008, begins with the dignity of human person, and he argues that the idea is best understood in terms of the importance of normative agency in the life of a human being. And the value of the normative agency of a human being discloses itself in that being's autonomy, that is, in her ability to determine for oneself what the shape of her life will be and what it is for her life to go well. So you start from a notion of human dignity defined in terms of ability to be the shepherd of your own life, to steer your life according to the conception that you may have of a good life, and you find human rights as quite simply the things that protect, the things you need in order to be a normative agent, in order to be in control of your life, in order to be able to decide about your life, to pursue a good life as you conceive of it. That's more or less Griffin's approach to human rights. And the Waldron things is a good example of this third way of conceiving the foundation, because basically in the notion of human dignity, he reads this notion of purposive agency, of sometimes he calls it personhood. You perhaps add some of the things that he calls practicalities, that is, empirical premises that help you to understand what you need in order to have a life that is directed according to the way you think should be. And you end up with the list of human rights that are grounded in the fact that you cannot have human dignity without having this kind of goods. Does Waldron like this way of understanding the foundation? Clearly not, because the one, well, he doesn't like for reason that he doesn't explain, but it's quite clear that the form of foundation he prefers is the fourth and final one, which is the kind of reflective equilibrium model that I was mentioning before. before. That is, we should not think of human dignity really as a sort of major premise in a syllogism. Then the minor premise might be the practicalities that I was mentioning, and the conclusion is human rights, as in the third model, the model of Griffin. Rather, we should conceive of human dignity and human rights as being at the same logical level, if you want. So, in the sense that one influences the other, but also the other way around. So, Waldron does not want to suggest that we should forget about human dignity, because this is not going to help us with human rights. That's certainly not his position. What he wants to avoid is this model, and what he wants to support is this model, in which, as I was trying to explain before, there is a sense in inquiring into human dignity, because human dignity is really what gives a unity, gives a coherent meaning to all the things that we find in human rights. So it is a concept that has this foundational role, but not in the sense that, we find the features that we find in human rights more or less implicitly already contained here. It's more an organizing idea that gives a coherent meaning to human rights. And at the same time, whatever we might discover about the content of human rights, in a sense, is going to influence also what we think about human dignity. So the relation is really one of reciprocal influence and beneficial influence, as opposed to one being at a different logical layer, like a major premises, and the other one being a conclusion. That's the fourth model. We begin with an understanding of the rights we have, maybe not a complete or fully elaborated understanding, but something like one of the list of human rights that we already have. And then we try to make sense of that, perhaps by considering the values that would have to be presupposed in order for this list of rights to be sensible. So we start from here, and we try to make sense of all the values, protections, liberties that we find already in the human rights as we know them, and we try to find an organizing idea that could be the one that makes sense of this plurality of values, of this plurality of things that we already find in human rights. And Waldron thinks human dignity is a good candidate. It's the organizing idea that sort of gives a unitary, coherent view of all the particular things and values that we find in human rights. And the second important thing that Waldron says, once we have understood that human dignity plays this role of theoretical unity, let's put it this way, and we keep on digging on human dignity, trying to understand better what it means, then this might influence back what we decide that human rights should protect. So, in this sense, it's a reflective equilibrium. We start from rights. I mean, he's a lawyer. He's a philosopher of law. I mean, what counts first? Remember his point about the origin, the first meaning of the foundation. What counts first are rights. Rights are things that have already been established. Let's start from what we already have. From this, you can do a philosophical reflection that goes in two directions. On the one hand, you may suggest that human dignity is the thing that makes sense of human rights and gives a coherent picture as opposed to a list of unrelated items that, you know, there is no explanation of why we have these rights as opposed to other rights. Once we have found this organizing idea, we may use it by making some progress in defining it, despite the difficulties we have seen. We may use it to increase our understanding of human rights. Okay, I think I'll stop here because I don't have time, but I urge you to read the rest of, I mean, there is not much more to be said about this paper, except for perhaps what he says in the dignity as status, which would be his interpretation of human dignity, but perhaps I can say something about that also at the beginning